First of all, thank you all very much for your interest in this new methodology and your participation on today's webinar. This is a huge milestone for Verra and for everyone who is engaged in REDD projects around the world, because we are, after a 2-year process almost, finally able to share with you the current draft of the methodology. And you haven't seen it since it was open for public consultation in last year around this time. So we really hope that you celebrate with us having achieved this milestone. And so what we're going to do today is just provide an overview of the webinar, of the methodology in its current state. And so there are many of you on this webinar. We're not going to be able to take all of your questions, but please do enter them in the question and answer box, because we will make sure that we address them on our website in the future, make sure that the information is there to address them on the website in the future, either in the frequently asked questions section about this methodology or somewhere else on the website. Our objectives for today are that stakeholders understand this methodology at a high level, and that we highlight the key changes since public consultation, and then you understand where the methodology is now and what our next steps are. This is by no means the final version, but we do want to share it with you right now so that you have an idea of how it's going to look. And I just want to say that we know that carbon markets are important for forest conservation, and we're very excited to release this methodology and have it be implemented at all. So our agenda today is that I'm going to provide some introduction and context. Then we're going to have an overview of activity data and allocation, collection and allocation. And then we're going to have a deep dive into the module, which is the key module of this methodology now, which is the module for estimation of emissions reductions from avoiding unplanned deforestation. And then we'll go over some of the next steps. So the key members of the methodology development team are all set out on this slide, and some of them are here today. So I would like to introduce Dr. Tim Pearson, Basanta Gautam of my team, Salvador Sanchez Colon of Verra, Marie Calmel of Verra, and Kevin Brown of Wildlife Conservation Society. Sorry, Tim Pearson works for Green Collar now. And so they're all going to be presenting on this webinar, but all of the other people on this slide, and many of you through stakeholder consultations or through individual conversations with Verra and or others in the market, can also contributed massively to the development and to helping us get to where we are now. So just to provide some background, the current methodologies and all other Verra methodologies currently in the voluntary market use the reference region approach, which was established many years ago at the beginning of REDD by the leading technical experts, and it has been the best and only available strategy so far. Because of new technology and our desire to align with government actions and accounting, we are able to now move to different approaches that are hugely beneficial and will help make just be the next stage of Verra's approach to REDD. So we've already implemented some of those changes that I referenced. One of the steps that we took was to implement shorter baseline periods for REDD, as we came up with the research that showed that shorter baseline periods are more appropriate. We shortened that last year from 10 years to 6 years. We are bringing together all of our 5 different REDD methodologies, which we'll be talking about later on, into this one consolidated methodology. And then we are using risk-based allocation, which we'll talk about a lot more today. And we have been working on this whole process since 2020, and along with our VCS, our jurisdictional nested REDD version 4. So they're all lined up at the jurisdictional level. The difference between JNR and this new consolidated methodology is that Verra is taking on the role of the jurisdictional proponent, or taking on some of those responsibilities on behalf of jurisdictions. So currently the methodology has this new structure. So we introduced a framework methodology, the methodology for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And then we have this new module for estimation of emission reductions for avoiding unplanned deforestation. The way that we came up with that module is that we combined all of the modules that were out for public consultation. So as you recall, for public consultation, we had a module for baseline activity data collection, and a module for activity shifting, and a module for monitoring. So we combined all of those because in order to use this methodology for an avoiding unplanned deforestation project, you would have to use all of those modules. And what is in the body of the current module is what needs to be done by the project proponent. What is in the appendices is what needs to be done by Verra or a data service provider on behalf of Verra. You'll hear more about that process later. In the future, we do intend to add modules under this same framework for estimating emissions from avoiding planned deforestation and estimating emissions from avoided unplanned degradation, forest degradation. Avoiding planned forest degradation in the VCS framework is an improved forest management activity. So, and then all of these modules will refer to existing VCS modules and tools. So so those modules and tools that are referred to in the avoiding unplanned deforestation module already exist in the VCS system, so you can go look those up on our website. So some additional changes from the public consultation version, besides the combining of all of the different modules that are out for public consultation into the new module, is that we are now calling for all avoiding unplanned deforestation projects to use this methodology. And in the future, all REDD projects will use this methodology. It's just that we don't have those components built in yet. So we now have a firm timeline for adoption of this methodology, both by new projects and existing projects. So existing projects will have to transition over from 6 months after activity data is available for their jurisdiction, and then new projects will have to adopt that as soon as there is activity data available for their jurisdiction. Now, there's a link to that timeline on this slide, and I should have said that all the slides and this meeting recording will be available on our website in the future. And so you'll be able to click the links yourself. But yeah, so we've clarified the roles and responsibility for data generation significantly in this new version of the methodology. And then in general, there are many different simplifications all throughout the module on the methodology itself. So now I will turn it over to my colleague Basanta Gautam to talk about activity data collection and allocation.
Thank you, Julie. Please, next slide.
Oops.
Yes. So in this slide, I'll be talking about the activity data and forest cover benchmark map development. So for the forest cover benchmark map, we need temporal satellite data, because we need to, so this is the map of forest and non-forest, just the binary 0 and 1, but it needs to be interpreted for 3 time points over the HRP. So start, midpoint, and the end of the historical reference period. And for the sample plot, we are requiring, the high resolution satellite data if possible. But in the following slide, I'll talk about the minimum requirement for the resolutions. And for this, there are 4 land cover change categories: stable forest, stable non-forest, deforestation, and forest regrowth. Though these 2 are separate steps written separately, but they can be conducted simultaneously for efficiency reason. And regarding the 4 change categories, the deforestation is only going to be considered for further steps, because the other change categories had not yet been included, as Julie mentioned in earlier slides. Next slide, please. So here I'm talking about the minimum requirements. So these are just, again, these are minimum, so whatever better can be done, it's preferable. For the satellite imagery, we are requiring a 10-meter resolution after 2015 and 30-meter resolution, special resolution before 2015. So the rationale for having this minimum requirement is that there is availability of Landsat for all the years and Sentinels after 2015. But again, for example, we know that planet data through NICFI is available until next year, so we prefer the data service provider use these high resolution data if possible. And for the uncertainty of deforestation estimates, so the minimum requirement is it should be equal or less than 10% at 90% confidence interval. So after that, there will be some discounting, and you can find details in the methodology, and also Kevin, my colleague, will be talking about it in the following presentation. And for the accuracy assessment of forest cover benchmark map, then we need this minimum requirement of 90% accuracy for forest at the end of the historical reference period, and the 70% for the deforestation over the historical reference period. So that is for the closed forest, but we also have the requirement for open forest. So that is less than 50% canopy cover. So these are just 10% less than the closed forest case. So 80% and 60% for forest and deforestation class respectively. And also, as you might know, that the request for proposal has been released, and it's available on our website. And there is a link for that. It's on the REDD methodology page of Verra. You could go and check there. And the deadline is 30 April. So these details are also included in the request for proposal that we have posted. Julie, next slide, please. And in addition to the data that we will be receiving or developing involving data service provider, we are also collecting data through crowdsourcing. And because we know that there are very useful data out there, so we would like to benefit from those data. And for this, this activity, for the activity data generation, we would be happy to receive like available NFI, National Forest Inventory plots, or any special stratification that is available. And especially because in the sample-based approach, we are excluding some of these identified exclusion area. Again, the detail will come in the following slides later on. So this kind of information will be used for activity data generation. And the available remote sensing imagery, ancillary special data, and project-related forest cover benchmark map. So these will be used for forest cover benchmark mapping. So that is jurisdictional forest cover benchmark mapping. And the map for potential arable land protection status and available peer-reviewed carbon stock maps will be used for mapping available land for activity shifting outside leakage belt, and also estimating carbon stock in the or for the outside leakage belt using the emission factor. And for this also, we have just posted the call for submission of supplementary materials from a stakeholder. So any stakeholder, governments, project proponents, NGO, INGO, scientific organization, universities working in any particular jurisdictions they can submit these data, and these will be considered in the further processing, or when the data service provider will work on developing the data for particular jurisdiction. So these will be assessed and used if they are comparably better than the data that we will be developing. And the deadline for this is 14th of May. So please do check details from the link. Next slide, please. I think this is for my colleague, Salvador, please.
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Unlike the existing methodologies in which project proponents were responsible for projecting the rate and location of future deforestation in the project area based on the methodology's requirements, the consolidated REDD methodology adopts a jurisdictional allocation approach. In this approach, first jurisdictional activity data are compiled for the entire jurisdiction, and then a fraction or a portion of the jurisdictional activity data are allocated to each of the project areas within the jurisdiction proportionate to the local risk of deforestation. This allocation then involves two steps or two procedures, complementary procedures. First, we have a procedure for modeling and in an spatially explicit fashion the risk of deforestation across the entire jurisdiction, and then based on the deforestation risk map that results from this procedure, the allocation procedure is used for allocating portions of the jurisdictional activity data to the project area in a direct proportion to the deforestation risk within the project area. Secondly, after that, the project proponents have to develop local level estimates of the relevant emission factors. And finally, with using the allocated activity data, project proponents literally multiply these by the activity data that have been allocated to the project area by the local estimation of emission factors, and by multiplying these two, the baseline for the project is constructed. Next slide, please. So the two procedures are first, the deforestation risk modeling and mapping. This was formulated recently and has been pilot tested by Clark Labs. The procedure involves two steps, complementary steps. First, what we call a benchmark or very simplistic model is constructed. In this benchmark model, the risk of deforestation at a given pixel, at a given location, is simply modeled as a function of the distance to forest edge. Even though distance to forest edge is really not a driver per se, not a driver of deforestation per se, it has been shown to successfully summarize or capture the end result of the drivers of deforestation operating in different parts of the jurisdiction. And therefore, it is quite able to predict, to project the future deforestation at a given area. At the same time, project proponents are encouraged or requested to submit additional layers of data layers of containing information that is relevant for drivers of deforestation, proper drivers of deforestation, like distance to roads, human settlements, economic activities, land tenure, and so on. with these additional data layers and more complex deforestation risk models can be built. And in the end, we end up with a set of deforestation risk models. First, the benchmark model, the very simplistic one, plus additional information-richer deforestation risk models. And we have to choose the deforestation risk model and map that has to be adopted for the entire jurisdiction. The selection of the jurisdictional deforestation risk model and map is based on a completely an entirely statistical criterion. First, it has to have the best model is the one that has the largest area under the total operating characteristic curve, and also its total operating characteristic curve is above all the others. The one model, the one deforestation risk model that meets these two requirements is the one that is identified as the best able to predict deforestation in the coming years across the entire jurisdiction, and is the one that is adopted by for the entire validity for the next validity period. Next slide, please. Once we have that one, we use the allocation procedure for allocating fractions of the jurisdictional activity data to the project areas within the jurisdiction based on the estimated risk of deforestation. For this, we use the allocation procedure or allocation tool. We have an initial version that was developed in the context of the BCS jurisdictional and nested REDD framework. That version, that initial version, was aimed at allocation portions of a jurisdictional FREL to the projects nested within the jurisdiction. It is a spreadsheet tool. It's a set of several spreadsheets. And this tool is being revised currently in order to achieve two things. On the one hand, it should be used either for allocating portions of the jurisdictional FREL within the context of the jurisdictional and nested REDD framework in a jurisdictional nested REDD program, or it can be used to allocate portions of the jurisdictional activity data to projects existing within the jurisdiction that use the consolidated REDD methodology. Those are the two procedures that will be used to allocate activity data to project areas within the jurisdiction, and then this information will be used by project proponents together with the local estimates of emission factors to construct the project baseline. Thank you.
Yeah, so one of the major changes introduced by this methodology is that part of the data to be used to define the baseline and develop the project description will not be produced by the project proponent, but by Verra or by data service providers contracted by Verra. So as just mentioned by Salvador, the baseline and Basanta, the baseline activity data will be allocated from jurisdictional baseline activity data using a jurisdictional map. And these jurisdictional data, both activity data, forest cover benchmark map, and risk map, will be produced by data service providers contracted by Verra through the request for proposal process that's Basanta presented. And so project proponent or other stakeholders will still have a chance to contribute and support the production of jurisdictional data. And they are invited to submit supplemental data, and Julie will speak out about those possible contributions later. This jurisdictional data and the allocation of activity data baseline to projects will be assessed by independent expert reviewers to be selected through a formal process that will be launched in the coming weeks. And once data are assessed, Verra will allocate activity data baseline to projects, and then the PP will be able to define their baseline, their final baseline, and develop the project description. So once the project description, is ready, project is listed under validation, and the public comment period has been initiated, the project will go through the usual validation verification process by a review. Of course, this multi-stakeholders approach will have implications for the project development process. Next slide, please. And so one of the impacts is that all projects using this consolidated methodology, or at least for now the AUD, avoided and planned deforestation projects, will be requested to list under developments. And it will no longer be an option for them to skip this initial listing stage and just start being listed under validation. That is a way for us to ensure the project is in the system at early stage of development so that we can allocate them activity data as soon as possible in the development process. So as a separate process, but that can be submitted at the same time, project proponents will submit what we call an activity data allocation request form, providing some basic information about the project, like project name, project proponents, project start dates, as well as KML file with the project area. And Verra will review this submission form based on where the project is located. So we'll review within which jurisdiction is the project located. Is there activity data baseline already? Is there already an activity data baseline and risk map that has been established for the jurisdiction? Is the project falling within one or two jurisdiction? And most of all, is the project falling within VCS GNR registered jurisdiction? Because all projects that are falling within a jurisdiction that has registered VCS GNR baseline or program must nest within these programs and will be allocated their baseline from the jurisdiction. The activity data baseline will be allocated to project following this methodology only for projects or portion of projects that are not falling within the VCS GNR registered baseline or program. Okay, so next slide, please. So just quickly mentioning that activity data must be allocated to project and then requested by projects for any new project. So when they, after requesting list pipeline listing under development and before requesting pipeline listing under validation, but also at the time of baseline reassessment, anytime projects has to reassess its baseline at the end of the baseline validity period, then a new activity data allocation request form has to be submitted. And for all projects, even though they haven't reached their the end of their baseline validity period, that will transition to this new methodology, projects that are already registered, they will also have to request that allocation. At verification, there is no need for allocation. The normal process will be used. It's just like project proponent will monitor deforestation in their project area and leakage belts using the sample-based approach that will be presented by Tim and Kevin at this stage.
Okay, I think that's on to me. Julie promised a deep dive into the module. Necessarily, unfortunately, this is going to have to be a shallow deep dive because I think we could all spend a day together going through the module in depth. But I'm hoping that right now, Kevin and I will have the opportunity to allow you to become situated within the module, understand how the module is structured and what the really key components are of the module and how they get put together and the steps you'd take to make your way through the module. So to give you that really big high-level view of the AU Def module, there are the key components. You will have heard them before, probably. I mean, definitely in this presentation, but it's good to really hit them on the head. So you have a jurisdictional level standardization of baseline activity data that's going to get allocated to the project via risk modeling. Leakage is divided into two parts under the methodology, as we've seen in some methodologies in the past. We have the geographically constrained agents of deforestation and those that are not geographically constrained. The concept for this is relatively simple. You have a leakage belt that's around the project area. If you have agents that are resident in that area, then any leakage they do, any activity shifting they do outside of the project area will be captured in the leakage belt. If, as happens in some parts of the world, you have agents migrating towards the project for the purpose of land use activities that drive deforestation, then the implementation of the project potentially leads to those agents going elsewhere in the country. And therefore, there have to be a conservative approach to deal with the leakage associated with those non-geographically constrained agents. The project, as we said, is responsible for developing emission factors. Those emission factors getting applied both in the baseline and in the project case and in the leakage belt. The proponent is responsible for activity data in the project case, that's monitoring for both the project area and the leakage belt. As Basanta said, activity data comes through remote sensing. The resolution is 30 meters up to 2015, 10 meters or better after 2015. A sampling approach is required. And uncertainty in this methodology, following what we're seeing in JNR already, involves a discounting of emission factors and activity data to make sure that the resulting emission reductions are conservative. Next slide. So this is the big level overview of the methodology. We think about the baseline, the project emissions, and the leakage sections, and dividing those between activity data, emission factors, and net emission. The baseline activity data is undertaken by the data service provider for Verra, and that's found in Appendix 1 of the methodology. Then the emission factors, net emissions are done by the project proponent, and those are in section 5.3.1. Project emissions, entirely the responsibility of the project proponent in those identified sections. And then leakage in the leakage belt, project proponent for the activity data, the emission factors, and then summing together for the net emissions. The outside leakage belt, the non-geographically constrained agents, the Appendix 2 gives details there of what the data service provider is requested to do in terms of coming up with an available area in which outside leakage belt leakage could occur and carbon stock that could be applied to those areas. Next slide. Applicability, important. At the methodology level, tidal wetlands at this point are excluded completely, and this follows the expectation that the update to VM33 is going to go ahead and include both tidal wetland restoration and tidal wetland conservation. So the entirety of responsibility for tidal wetlands moves out of this methodology and will be covered by VM33. At the module level, talking about avoided unplanned deforestation, we exclude planned deforestation. That's going to be in the future module for avoided planned deforestation. We also exclude leakage prevention activities that are going to cause emissions that aren't accounted for, and this is essentially associated with drainage of wetlands, flooded agriculture, confined feeding operations. The module also excludes where a JNR FREL exists, where the project would therefore be sitting under JNR rather than under this BCS methodology, and also where baseline deforestation constitutes reforestation. We're looking to avoid that situation where there is a very small emission factor because the post-deforestation stock is very high, and this is situations where post-deforestation is not replanting with trees or allowing trees to regrow. Next slide. When we think about the progression through the module, here are the key steps. You start in looking at the project efficacy. You're required to define this area, we call it the project activities region, where leakage management activities are going to be implemented. We require a definition of the deforestation agents and the causal chain of deforestation. All of this to come up with a better understanding of the project and a better set of ex-ante estimates that can be defended. An estimate of the project efficiency at reducing deforestation associated with the permanence. We're looking at internal permanence risks and risks of leakage that could occur. Then move into the meat and look at the baseline. We're going to get the activity data by risk class from Verra that's going to be provided by the data service provider. The project proponent then in step 2B allocates the activity data by risk class to its actual strata, the project strata the project has come up with itself. The project also conducts its own field work in order to generate emission factors and goes through the statistical process, propagating errors, calculating the relative uncertainty, and if exceeding the 10% level, discounting those emission factors, and then pulling together the emission factor and the activity data to get the annual baseline emissions. Then onto the project emission side, there has to be this ex-ante emission reduction estimate that is defensible and gives credibility. Then once the project's implemented, there's the collection of activity data, and where that activity data is outside the acceptable level of uncertainty, there's an inflation in this case for uncertainty to ensure conservativeness. The baseline should be as low as possible and the project emissions as high as possible. So we inflate the activity data in the project case where it's higher than that allowable 10%, following the methods that are in the methodology, and I think I talk about briefly on the next slide. And the activity data in this case is collected both for the project area and the leakage belt, and you determine the net emissions for the project area. And then in section 4, you determine the leakage belt emissions using your activity data and your carbon stocks. And then you look at leakage outside the leakage belt, the non-geographically constrained. Here there's this important factor, which is the proportion immigrant. So a survey has to be conducted of the area looking at potential agents of deforestation who are engaged in land use activities that are associated with baseline deforestation. And the proportion of those is considered the proportion that potentially would be leaking outside the leakage belt. And then market effects leakage is also considered using the market effects leakage module that was originally created under BM7, only in the case where there is commercial timber harvested as part of the deforestation process. Finally, bring it all together, sum it, and get your net emission reductions and subtract your permanence deduction using the Verra tool. Next slide. Uncertainty. As I said, it's handled a little differently than some of the existing methodologies, which often try and come up with a total offset uncertainty. Often this is not entirely correctly done statistically, as we've learned through time. And also it generally only is applied to emission factors rather than activity data. And now in this methodology, we definitely want to get at the uncertainty associated with the activity data and the emission factors. And we use this discounting approach to capture this and ensure conservativeness. But the activity data, as I said, the baseline deforestation is conservatively discounted, it's conservatively lowered, and in the monitoring case, the activity data is conservatively inflated, raised. The approach is the same as in the JNR, and it builds on the approach of Dr. Tilney that's in the publication there. Next slide. So the really key elements of the module to bring together everything I'm saying is on the boundary level, Verra, largely through its data service provider, is going to define the boundary of the jurisdiction that's going to be considered by the project. It defines the leakage belt the project is going to be responsible for, and it defines the baseline validity period that the project will operate within. For applicability, no planned deforestation, no tidal wetlands, no post-deforestation, reforestation. Those are the key factors that force choice of a different module or methodology if you fall into those categories. In the baseline case, there's the standardization of activity data, risk mapping, and allocation across the jurisdiction that's conducted by Verra through the data service provider. And the activity data is discounted for uncertainty where it exceeds the allowable amount. Emission factors are developed by the project, and those emission factors also are discounted for uncertainty. In the monitoring case, the project proponent collects your activity data across the project area and the leakage belt using a sampling approach, and the activity data is inflated for uncertainty. And then the last key element, leakage belts monitored by the proponent. Any increase in activity data above the allocation to the leakage belt by the data service provider is counted as a leakage emission. And then there is a deduction for leakage outside the leakage belt based on this proportion immigrant factor, and the data service provider providing a carbon stock for the area where leakage could occur to outside the leakage belt. I think we're going to go to Kevin now for more of a deeper dive on the activity data side.
Great, thanks, Tim. So we wanted to highlight the activity data component a little bit because it comes up both at the jurisdictional scale and it's undertaken by the data service provider, but then again by the project proponent through their monitoring activities. And I wanted to, the process for activity data development is quite similar in both cases, but I wanted a chance to kind of put them side by side and talk through some of the key differences in the two. So some of this you've heard already. Activity data for the jurisdiction, you're calculating a land cover change over the previous 10 years historical reference period, and using that as the historical average of that rate is taken to be the baseline activity data over the next 6 years. In the monitoring case, the project proponent is conducting a similar type of activity data estimation, but just over the period covered by that monitoring event. They both utilize a sample-based approach, and they both use conservative discounts. Again, it's a discount for the baseline activity data from the jurisdiction and an inflation factor for the monitoring case. In both cases, there's this process of defining the sampling frame for which the activity data sampling will be undertaken within, and which is essentially taking the jurisdiction or the project area and leakage belt and then subtracting out some of these identified exclusions, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail. You can move to the next slide. So I'll just kind of talk you through step by step of how this will be undertaken at both for the jurisdictional case, for the baseline, and then for the project monitoring. So in both cases, you have to define your sampling frame. And for this jurisdiction, this is taken to be the entire jurisdiction minus identified exclusions. For the project case, monitoring would be undertaken in the combined area of the project of that project's leakage belt and project area. The identified exclusions are, I think there's a list of some of them on the next slide, but these are in the case of the jurisdiction, these are essentially areas of certain types of land cover transitions, where in the case of deforestation, these would be large deforestation events that are caused by drivers unrelated to the drivers of unplanned deforestation in the project, and for which you would not want the signal of that event getting factored into the total estimation of activity data for that jurisdiction. So it's a conservative step to prevent things like large-scale natural disturbances or large government planned infrastructure clearings for infrastructure from unrealistically inflating the jurisdictional activity data. And then other things can be excluded, like large permanent bodies of water that are just never going to have any forest in them. They can be excluded from the sampling frame. Once the sampling frame has been defined for either the jurisdiction or the project, a sampling strategy has to be developed. For the jurisdiction, there's not a prescriptive approach for how this should be undertaken. The data service providers that submit applications to produce this data can propose an approach that is appropriate for that jurisdiction, as long as it is representative of the patterns of expected deforestation in that country, in that jurisdiction. For the project case, there's a little bit more guidance on the stratification approach. You're required to stratify by any forest types that you're using in your carbon accounting. So if you stratified your forest types, you need to use that in your sampling stratification. You need to stratify by the project area and leakage belt, and then also an additional stratification along some factor that is expected to capture the difference in where you would where you're expecting to observe deforestation over that period. So areas of high to low risk, for example. In the jurisdiction, you interpret sample plots to these 4 main land cover change categories: stable forest, deforestation, forest regrowth, stable non-forest. But for the project monitoring, the focus now is just on unplanned deforestation. As Tim mentioned, there's uncertainty is estimated for activity data in both cases. In the jurisdiction, activity data is discounted if uncertainty is above 10%, but there's a hard 20% ceiling on uncertainty. So in no cases should the data service providers be developing activity data estimates that exceed 20% uncertainty. For the project case, the 10% uncertainty threshold is still there. So if your uncertainty is less than 10%, there's no inflation. But we took out the upper limit on uncertainty, and this has to do with the issue where a project that has a very, very low deforestation rate, it becomes very mathematically challenging, even with like thousands of observations, to meet a 20% upper estimate. So we left in the inflation factor above 10%, but then it's more on the projects to do kind of the cost benefit of what's an allowable level of uncertainty and what amount of inflation of the activity data are they willing to take. And then finally, once the either discounting or inflation factors are calculated, those are applied to the estimate of the area of deforestation. So for the jurisdiction, you're just getting a single number for forests. It's not separated by any kind of forest class or driver or anything. So it's a single number that's been discounted. But for the project case, you are reporting broken down by whether it was from the leakage belt or the project area, and also broken down by what forest class it comes from, because those forest classes have different emission factors associated with them. Next slide. Just a few other kind of points of difference between these. Again, who is doing this activity? For the jurisdiction, it's the data service provider contracted through Verra. For the project case, it's the project proponent. I've talked through some of these, so I think I'll just mention that there's a little bit of nuance in the differences around how the identified exclusions work between the jurisdiction and the project case. For the jurisdiction, typically there's a size threshold of areas of these that meet these categories that are contiguous areas of 1,000 hectares or more should be identified and excluded. For the project case, the project, you essentially inherit the maps that are made for the jurisdiction. So anything that's excluded at the jurisdiction gets inherited down to the project. But then any additional identified exclusions that occur within the monitoring period, say there's a natural disturbance that happens during the monitoring period that is captured by the project, the minimum size threshold for such an event would be 100 hectares. So if that event is 100 hectares or more, then that can be delineated and then removed from the sampling frame. And what happens to that in terms of the greenhouse gas accounting is that in the example of a natural disturbance, that the activity data that would have been allocated to that area under the baseline, and then any monitoring of that area are essentially zeroed out to one another. So those events are essentially cut out of any project emission reductions calculations. So I think I've talked through the rest of this. So I'll end here on activity data.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Let me just turn on my video. Great. So yeah, thank you very much. We have just a few minutes left now to talk about the next steps involved with this methodology. I know that that last section was quite technical, and hopefully you will all look into the draft methodologies that we have posted, or draft methodology and module that we posted on our website, to take a deeper dive. As Tim said, there was only so much time in this presentation, so we just covered the highlights, but there is a lot more detail in the methodology itself and the module. And thanks so much for all of the great questions you've been sending in. Some of them we've been able to answer in this presentation, hopefully. Some of them we will need to follow up on. But just to give you an overview of where we're going and where we've been, so as I mentioned, this whole process started in October of 2020 with the finalization of JNR version 4 and the options assessment starting for how to standardize the existing AUDD methodologies so that they would be more consistent with each other for different activity types, and also more aligned with the jurisdictional and nested REDD to help facilitate the transition to government-run REDD programs. By April of 2022, we developed these different modules that are now in the avoiding unplanned deforestation module. And so we consulted on those last year, as you might recall. And then from July to August, we kind of took stock of those comments, and we decided to move to a consolidated methodology approach, where we're going to now have one big framework for all REDD projects. And a lot of you are asking about how you combine different activity types with the REDD methodology. And we have procedures for that within the VCS program for using multiple methodologies at the same time. In the transition period, before we have the avoiding planned deforestation or avoiding unplanned forest degradation modules in this methodology, we will not be withdrawing the other existing methodologies. So you can use those modules from those methodologies at the same time as you use this avoiding unplanned deforestation methodology. So then we revised the modules per your comments and per all the other consultations that we had going on. And at the same time, we revised the risk mapping and allocation tools, those procedures that Salvador talked about earlier in the presentation. So a lot of your comments in the consultation were about issues with those tools. So we're taking those on board and revising them, to make them better. And we started the VBB assessment of this methodology. We started this in April, actually. It's ongoing right now. And so that's the version that we've shared with you. Sorry, this slide should say April through June of 2023 is the VBB assessment of the methodology and the module. And so in Q3, so July through September of this year sometime, we have targeted as the methodology publication date. And we have targeted that for the first activity data to be available to be allocated to projects. By Q4, the end of 2024, we have targeted that all activity data will be available for all of the jurisdictions where we currently have REDD projects. And by 2025, we are hoping that all REDD projects will be using this new methodology or will be nested in a JNR program. The first jurisdictions for which we are developing activity data are these ones that you see here that are also listed in the announcement that we put out today. And what we will be, as I mentioned, developing data for all of the jurisdictions over time, hopefully by the end of 2024. We don't exactly know how long this process will take. It could take 3 to 6 months is what we think, but we are still working that out, and it will be easier for jurisdictions where there is high quality data available, and more challenging for larger jurisdictions and those jurisdictions where there is not high high quality data available. Some of the key resources, just to sum up, are the draft of the methodology and module that you see here on the right or the left-hand side. And these, I just want to be clear, are subject to change before publication. And we've already made changes to the versions that you see online, thanks to some of the assessors' early feedback and some just like changes that we've noticed that we need to make, so typos and things like that. And then we want you to contribute. We have this ongoing request for proposals for activity data development and forest cover benchmark maps. And so data service providers, potential data service providers are encouraged to apply to that. And then we have a call for submissions for supplemental materials from stakeholders for the same kinds of materials that the data service providers will then review. Those both have upcoming deadlines that are really tight turnarounds, but we will be issuing further submissions in the future for this kind of information because we need to address more than just the first 12 jurisdictions. And then I just put down here a link to the project transition timeline, which we referred to earlier in the presentation. But that's the timeline for which projects will all need to transition over or adopt this new methodology. So that is available there for your reference. We have a couple other slides, but we're right at the top of the hour now. So I think that we can wrap up. And if you have questions, please contact Salvador or Basanta, but wait until we've updated our FAQs on our site. If your questions are urgent, please contact these guys, but we'll update the FAQs on our site with thanks to all of your great questions that you've shared with us today. So I'm going to wrap it up there. I just want to thank you all for your patience with us as we have been working on this development and all of your contributions that you've made along the way, and just share with you how excited we are to get to this point. And we're looking forward to getting this methodology available to you and in working in the market. So thank you very much, and we'll talk to you soon.